Farewell, Johannes, by Werner Bonefeld. Johannes Agnoli's death in 2003 deprived us of one of the most important thinkers of the categorical imperative of human emancipation. Johannes Agnoli is dead. He died on the 4th of May in San Quirico di Moriano, Tuscany. He was 78 years old. Since his retirement from the Free University of Berlin in 1991, he had lived in his native Italy in a house that he bought when the West German backlash against the radical movements of the 1970s had reached its peak, the German autumn of 1977. One has to wonder whether he thought then that he would actually be able to ever live in his new home. This not because he favored the Siberian winters in Berlin, but because of the backlash itself. His comrade and friend Tony Negri and many other Italian comrades were moved from teaching the categorical imperative of human emancipation to prison. Agnoli's comrade Peter Brückner, with whom he had co-authored The Transformation of Democracy in 1968, each contributing a book-length chapter, had been expelled from his teaching post at the University of Hanover. After a long and prolonged battle over the right of a professor to hold and express independent thoughts, Brückner was reinstated in 1981. He died shortly afterwards. Agnoli was one of the categorical imperative's most important thinkers, in Germany and beyond. His experience of the German autumn of 1977 brought to the fore, if indeed that was needed, the important difference between scholarly work and loyalty to the constitution of political power, two different and conflicting endeavors. Agnoli argued that scholarly work was not to serve existing powers, but that its determination entailed the critique of all forms of constituted power, Macht. Its task was invoking Kant's response to the request for a declaration of loyalty to the Constitution from the Prussian king, to reveal the deceitful publicity of constituted order and not to contribute to its mystification. He was the practical theoretician of West Germany's 1968, and his Transformation of Democracy gave theoretical expression to the then extra-parliamentary opposition and to numerous generations who took Marx's insight seriously, that all those who live from their labor and the sale of their labor, quote, find themselves directly opposed to the form in which, hitherto, the individuals of which society consists have given themselves to collective expression, that is, the state. In order, therefore, to assert themselves as individuals, they must overthrow the state, end quote. The German ideology. Agnoli's work focused on the critique of the political, of the constituted power of capitalist social relations. This critique was not one of academic fashion, dictated, as it were, by conditions of extra-parliamentary movements. Conditions changed, and many extra-parliamentarians became parliamentarians. Agnoli's work was that of the categorical imperative of human emancipation, whatever the time and whatever the demands of power. Agnoli's was the endeavor of reason. His weapon of critique, which thinks the organized negation of all those relations where man exists as a miserable, exploited, and dominated being. Agnoli was the thinker of human dignity. He thought not with his head down. Agnoli thought not with his head down, bowing to existing forms of domination, and seeking respectability through critical criticism, where everything that is criticized is also endorsed as the best of all worlds. His head breathed the clear air of reason. That is, the society of the free and equal. Nor did he think while kneeling before the altar of relativism, where the critique of existing relations goes forward alongside the critical realist conviction that miserable human conditions need not to be changed, but only interpreted more favorably. His was the critique of constructive thought. He was an honest and sincere thinker. Conflict, he argued, was conducive to the stability of bourgeois social relations, as long as it is handled constructively. Constructively handled conflicts do not challenge existing social relations of domination. Such conflicts work within the forms of a bourgeois world, affirming rather than negating the forms of capitalist domination, such as the form of the state, as potentially useful instruments of, quote, revolutionary, end quote, change from, quote, within, end quote. Against the notion of conflict as a means of achieving institutional recognition, acceptance, and power, he argued that the incorporation of negative power into those same bourgeois institutions that it ostensibly seeks to abolish from within, or much less, based on revolutionary rhetoric, to transform through honest and committed reform work, renders negative power powerless. It disarms itself. Instead, then, of the revolutionizing of institutions, negative power is institutionalized and thus made responsible for the reproduction of capitalist social relations. And the seizure of the state and its use as an instrument of emancipation? The state, Agnoli argued, is not a neutral form that can be used for different antagonistic social interests. The state is not a state in capitalist society, but a capitalist state. The state's seizure does not lead to human emancipation, but to the employment of its form-determined role as a coercive power in relation, especially, to those who are ostensibly seen as the objects of emancipation. Objects they remain. What changes is the mode of domination. Against revolutionary conceptions that operate on the terrain or within the forms of bourgeois society, Agnoli argued in favor of social autonomy, that is, the self-determination and self-emancipation of the social individual in organizational forms of resistance that anticipate the goal of revolution in their means of resistance, human emancipation. Agnoli's critique of the political was thus a critique in favor of anti-institutional forms of struggle, in favor of organizational forms of human social self-determination, of the social autonomy of the dependent masses, in and against capitalist forms of domination. Agnoli's stance was hardly original. Agnoli merely agreed with Marx's argument that the coercion of bourgeois society is concentrated in the form of the state, which made his stance what made his stance original was that he analyzed this insight in contemporary society. Agnoli's originality lies in his understanding of Marx's work as a judgment on existence, as a conceptualized social practice. Like Marx, he rejected forms of anti-capitalism that do not oppose, but rather derive their rationale from constituted capitalist forms. This then accounts for his focus on social autonomy. The enunciation of, quote, social autonomy, end quote, is all too often treated as some sort of romantic abdication of working-class politics, a refusal to pose the hard question of socialism as the seizure of power on behalf of the working class. Yet again, Agnoli's categorical imperative of human emancipation as the movement of social autonomy was not original. His originality was its disruption, was its disputation in the context of contemporaneous class struggles. This is the classical enunciation of autonomy as a negative power. Quote, every emancipation is a return to the human world and human relationships to humans themselves. Political emancipation is the reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of bourgeois society, an egoistic and independent individual, on the other hand, to a citizen of the state, a moral person. Not until the real individual man has taken the abstract citizen back into himself, as an individual man, has become a species being in his empirical life, in his individual work and individual relations. Not until man recognizes and organizes his, quote, forces propres, forces propes, end quote, as social forces, and thus no longer separate social forces from himself in the form of political forces, not until then will human emancipation be completed, end quote. Karl Marx, The Jewish Question. Some might object because the quotation is from the early Marx, and since Marx is said to have matured with age, a quotation from the mature works Marx is called for. The, quote, mastery of capital over man, end quote, has to be abolished so that man's social reproduction is, quote, controlled by him, end quote. And the state, its purpose in the, quote, perpetuation of the laborer, end quote. The state's purpose is the, quote, perpetuation of the laborer, end quote. The, quote, sine qua non of the existence of capital, end quote. Agnoli's critique of the political and his critique of constructive conflict belong together. Unlike his orthodox Marxist adversaries, who reveled in the dogmatism of critical thought, and therewith its transformation into ritualized thinking of a quasi-religious sort, Agnoli, with relish, put his revolution as a question. Orthodox endeavors, in contrast, detest destructive critique, and are suspicious of any mistrust in their stance, since it, like a mole digging underfoot, undermines the belief in the correctness of conditions and revolutionary conceptions. Agnoli's view is a theory of heresy, of sensuous critical activity, of subversion and revolution. Agnoli had no time for dogmatic certainties or orthodox ideas of the seizure of state power. Agnoli held on to Marx's dictum that for the social individuals to be free to self-determine their own conditions, the state had to be abolished. Marx's dictum that the emancipation of the working class can only be achieved by the working class itself was his dictum. His stance was that of the society of the free and equal, of social autonomy in, against, and beyond capitalist social relations. Unlike many of his comrades of 1968, Agnoli saw no virtue in the long march through the institutions, and his critique of the transformation of the social movements of the 1970s into the form of the party, the German Greens, was of truly outstanding quality and foresight. It showed a professor who takes himself seriously. He professed. Those who seriously want freedom but battle all destabilizing activity contradict themselves. Agnoli did not write pamphlets, nor did he engage in agitation and propaganda. Agnoli's was the business of enlightenment, so that poverty and misery achieves consciousness of themselves. Agnoli's was the business of enlightenment, so that poverty and misery achieve consciousness of themselves. Enlightenment as subversive consciousness and revolutionary practice. In Agnoli's critique of orthodox Marxism, in his analysis of fascism, of technocracy, of the recomposition of the state, especially during the 1970s, in his critique of the form of the party as a means of emancipation, and of the form of the state as an instrument of revolution, in his critique of the deceitful publicity of liberal democracy and its transformations, in his contributions to socialist thought and practice, or his work on the history of subversive thought and the critical tradition of the Enlightenment, in all his work he remained with charm, revolutionary patience and irony, a professor of antagonism and revolution. He was not an administrator of thought. Agnoli thought. Agnoli was the thinker of the organized negation of inhuman conditions. He did not graft his subversive cunning onto capitalist society and its state, as if it were possible to criticize the things without being within them. He stood within the things themselves, posing the categorical imperative of emancipation, analyzing the class antagonism and engaging in the class struggle. Nor was he interested in the academic industry of conceptual innovation, which pretends that only that thought is true, which sells on the market. Thought for him was not a trend-setting commodity that finds its means and ends, its market, in the zeitgeist. He thought subversion, whatever the zeitgeist. Agnoli's ad hominem critique of capital and its state espoused human emancipation as the sine qua non of thought, which takes itself seriously, and because of this uncovers and focuses on the root of human existence. But for man, the root is man himself, and man is the highest being for man. Agnoli took the categorical imperative seriously. All relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being have to be overthrown so that man is in control of his own affair. As emancipated social individuals who relate each other as equals in freedom. The society of the free and equal, where each receives according to their needs, constituted for Agnoli the categorical imperative of the critique of capital and its state. Agnoli's destruction of the determination of the scholar in miserable times argued that with biting irony against the constructive endeavors of the zeitgeist. He returned to the issue in his last publication, The Hardening of the Political Form, Post-Fascism Within Globalization, from 2003, The Negative Potential, 2002, Emancipation, Paths and Goals, 2002, and The Transformation of the Left. The last title offers an intriguing twist. His Transformation of Democracy of 1968 showed the necessity of extra-institutional politics as the only reliable safeguard against the dead end of institutional politics and its constructive endeavors to humanize inhuman conditions. Such politics, he argued, are premised on constructively handled conflicts, affirming but not negating bourgeois society and its institutions. It thus seeks to square the circle. The humanization of inhuman conditions presupposes these same conditions, and thus accepts them as eternal. We all live in bourgeois society. It can, however, not be left behind by merely living within it. The negation of bourgeois society moves in and against its constituted forms. This is the site of class antagonism and class struggle. Only organized negation is able to transform the existence of class struggle in and against bourgeois social relations into the beyond of human history. Agnoli's Transformation of the Left from 2000 analyzed the idea of national self-determination as a form of socialist opposition to globalization. What is anti-capitalistic and anti-capitalism when it seeks to regulate capital without touching the relations of exploitation? When it poses the national state as the sovereign power that places controls on capital to secure the common national good? What is the common national good? The function and role of the state is to achieve homogeneity of national conditions. In its liberal conception, this means the equality of all before the law. In Leninist conception, it means the equality of labor. In its nationalist version, it means equality of a nation as a folk. In its essence, the Leninist conception of equality amounts to an economy of labor, the liberal conception of equality to the much-praised democracy of demand and supply, and the national conception of equality in terms of folk entails the projection of a classless, quote, national community, end quote, whose existence is threatened by, quote, the external enemy within, end quote. The affirmation of the national state, instead of criticizing globalization through organizational forms of resistance that anticipate in their means, the ends of the society and of the free and equal, sacrifices reason in favor of abstract and indeed regressive forms of equality, seeking salvation through the strengthening of the national state as an instrument of anti-globalization. The purpose, Agnoli argued, of capital is to make profit, not to create employment. The political existence of this purpose is the state. By contrast, the projection of the national state as an instrument of anti-globalization affirms the state as if it were, quote, an independent being which possesses its own intellectual, ethical, and libertarian bases. End quote. Critique of the Gotha program. It thus amounts to a mere rebellion for a virtuous state, a state, that is, which secures the, quote, communal interest, end quote, of bourgeois society. Regardless, as Agnoli argued, of its historically changing forms, the role and function of the bourgeois state has always been to secure the, quote, communal interests of a capitalistically organized form of social reproduction, capitalist accumulation. Agnoli's The Negative Potential consists of a series of interviews held in 2000 and 2001. The focus is on human self-emancipation, the means and ends of revolution, the purpose of scholarly work, negation and subversion, the critique of capital and capital state, and the critique of an anti-capitalism without anti-capitalism, that is, an anti-capitalism that merely seeks to reform the institutional regulation of the exploitation of labor. The Negative Potential, that was his work, an endeavor that cannot be commodified nor commercialized. The Frankfurter Allgemeine argued after the republication of his Transformation of Democracy in 1990, that his writings do not meet the demands of the market. The newspaper got it right. One wonders, though, whether it understood its own assessment. Subversive thinking is that which the market society of demand and supply fails to commercialize and absorb. His teaching and writing are a passionate affair of disputation. Marx's motto, quote, doubt everything, end quote, was Agnoli's. To doubt is to reveal. That is, theoretical mysteries find their rational explanation in the understanding and comprehension of human social practice. Agnoli had little time for the demands of academia. Publishing in refereed journals, getting research funding, finding respectability and a recognized member of the profession, invent a new concept and corner the market by setting the research agenda, and achieve fame at least for a brief moment, voice criticism but do not engage in critique, etc. In contrast to the PowerPoint thinking and delivering lecturer, Agnoli was an orator. Thinking critically, he insisted, consists in the question posed, not in the answer to the question not asked. Why do human social relations take the form of relations between things? And what needs to be done to achieve human emancipation from the perverted existence of human social practice as a personification of things? Agnoli pursued his questions with charming irony, espousing the self-contradictory endeavor of thought that, ostensibly critical, seeks respectability by offering positive proposals to effect the humanization of a capitalist world. Such humanization is in effect to be welcomed. Yet only radical opposition to capital and its state, Agnoli argued, is able to obtain humanizing concessions. Pacification affected through what Marx called, in his analysis of the struggle over the reduction of the working day, the golden chain of legal regulation. He never tired to demand democracy, not as some sort of democracy that abstracts from the social individual, but the democracy of the society of the free and equal. Social autonomy and democracy belong together. Democratization without human emancipation presupposes the exploitation of man by man as eternal. Humanization of inhuman conditions, he argued, time and time again, presupposes inhuman conditions, and it is these inhuman conditions that require democratic transformation, so that man is in possession of himself as a subject. His negation of contemporary conditions invoked the democratic self-determination of the social individual who, through the realm of freedom, regulates the realm of necessity and freedom from coercion, that is, through democratic means of social self-organization, through human social cooperation. Human emancipation and the idea of the humanization of bourgeois institutions belong to two different worlds. For Agnoli, human emancipation meant a classless society, a society where domination of man over man is abolished. In his last published work in English, he again discussed the categorical imperative of human emancipation, insisting that the means of resistance have to anticipate the ends of human emancipation in their organizational forms. Should the left put up candidates for election, create cosmopolitan democratic structures far removed and abstracting from the real human subject, or should democracy be sought where, according to the advocates of liberal democracy, it does not belong? The democratic self-organization of, quote, man's relationship to himself, end quote, Grundrisse, of the associated producers who, through the realm of freedom, organize the realm of necessity according to individual human needs. His scholarly work of negation will surely be missed. Agnoli was one of the few veritable thinkers of human emancipation. We have lost a friend, a comrade, a teacher, and we will have to do without his charm and irony. Above all, we will have to do without his delightful and always challenging formulation of the categorical imperative of negation, of human emancipation. Farewell.